Thank you. I'm actually no longer at the Sensible City Lab, but I'm excited to be here, and thank you. I'm excited to follow Panos because I will continue to explore this idea of reverse planning. The overarching point I want to make is that the state must always be rediscovered. This is a challenge that John Dewey gave us almost 100 years ago. The state, the ways we live together, must always be rediscovered. The crisis we find ourselves in is multidimensional. It reflects our institutions and their failing. From the broken food systems and ineffective healthcare that caused the coronavirus pandemic, to the economic inequality and racism that are ever more clear, especially here in the United States. We must rediscover how we live together. One way to look at this is, yes, from outer space. And that's the theme here, looking at the Earth from the satellite of the expert or philosopher, or maybe the tech elite here at MIT. Another is from the actual thick of it, from the individual experiences and injustices, the strategies and resourcefulness of specific people and publics on the ground, what Bruno Latour calls terrestrial logic. This was the starting point for an editorial project we did recently with the Site magazine called Provisions. We invited short contributions from a wide range of people, and it became a special issue of the magazine. We asked people to reflect on one of three things. First, what provisions are you taking with you from this exceptional time? What are you learning from this moment? Second, what provisions did you already have with you? And how are they helping you survive now? Third, what provisions or exceptions are you seeing that trouble you? Things like temporary extensions of power through contact tracing technology. The project is about multiplying lenses, about bringing different perspectives into a kaleidoscope. And it's become a rich collection of ideas and strategies and warnings. Now, the question is, what do we do with that? How do we put all those provisions to use in the future? Imagine if my friends at MIT here created an open source, decentralized way of rapidly manufacturing masks. Should you try that in Milan? And did the MIT guys completely ignore the distribution problem? Does Taiwan actually have a good strategy that we could borrow? In general, how do you try out a strategy and see if it should exist here? And how do you come up with new ideas in a particular place? In other words, how do we hear the signal through all of this noise around the world? If this Triennale is about rediscovering how we live together on and with planet Earth, we need to hear that signal. We must learn and discover together. We have to experiment. So a few years ago, I started noticing that actors from government and business and academia and community groups were doing experiments with new technologies and policies in cities. This can be anything from new mobility systems and vehicle sharing to new land development models and architectural strategies. So over the past 4 years, I did a large-scale research to understand how people are experimenting with technology and policy and regulation. We found a few things. On one hand, we created a typology of experiments, and we documented some of the best practices. We also saw the dangers of using an experiment as a site for extending power without any built-in checks and balances. See, by definition, an experiment breaks the status quo. It's outside of the norm. And in some cases, the norm is just bureaucratic red tape, and you should cut it. But in other cases, the norm exists for a very good reason. It's democratic process. It's there to prevent the abuse of power or economic injustice, or it's there to provide transparency and oversight. So it's extremely important to understand what experiments are actually happening in actual cities. So specifically, we saw experiments doing two very interesting things. The first is related to alternative political and economic structures. See, experiments usually end up creating a conventional technology or a government program or a startup. And that's not really a bad thing. It might be a new kind of green energy system, for example. But in other cases, the most vibrant and interesting cases, an experiment leads to completely alternative structures. Like, imagine a cooperative geothermal heat pump that's owned by every member of a neighborhood, and makes a perpetual legal contract with the ecological watershed that it's drawing from. These experiments lead to strange hybrids of things we typically like to keep separate and well-defined, like regulation, ownership, value. They're revealing alternative governance models in order for those technologies to continue existing. Many of these experiments are destabilizing conventional ideas of ownership, for example. So this is especially common with experiments in land and property rights. So normally in the United States, you can own land, and that allows you to build whatever you want, to exclude whoever you want, and to pollute all that you want. So it's no surprise that there are racial and economic and ecological injustices built into land ownership regimes. By cracking these open, experiments begin to use alternative kinds of investment and returns, different architectural typologies of building, collective rights to access a space, new responsibilities for ecological stewardship. These can begin to happen in an experiment. The second key observation is that experiments can be a place for deliberating common futures. They can be a way not only to develop new strategies and systems and technologies, but actually to see and experience them, and then to deliberate whether or not they're desirable. This begins to radically shift agency away from experts and shift from abstract ideas to tangible accounts. Now, this is important because a lot of new ideas and technologies imply genuinely conflicting values. They affect different populations in different ways. A network of micromobility vehicles will mean something different to a young, wealthy millennial and to a single mother of three. An experiment lets us actually see those effects and bring the effect stakeholders into contact. Experiments cultivate attachments between these different actors. By trying it out, we're building accountability. And in these exceptional spaces, actors become accountable to each other and to our ecosystems. So, in other words, we can define what a technology or a system is, but also to deliberate if and how it should exist here and now with this community. That's not the norm with typical startup technology. The experiment is there to reveal how we're all entangled in a place, entangled with technology, and it begins to structure a lasting web. This is what Stefano opened today's session by describing as decentralizing ourselves as individuals and as a human species. So I want to end by coming back to this present moment. During the past weeks and months, it's become clear that everything is an experiment. The legendary graphic designer Tibor Kalman said, "Everything is an experiment." And the COVID-19 crisis, the social mobilization we're seeing today in the United States, they've made this governments and companies and community groups are experimenting with new strategies to deal with this crisis. New things are emerging. We're seeing a glimpse of a dynamic and living policy in both good and bad ways. We can read the provisions from the Site magazine through the lens of experiments. Do these projects create alternative economics and governance? Do they allow us to deliberate our shared futures and create accountabilities? In that way, COVID-19 and the social mobilization in the US have been a probe or a sensor of all the structural weaknesses in our society and in our economy. So today, when everything is becoming an experiment, it's clear that we need to change those existing power structures to build accountability with the most vulnerable in society. This moment has made it clear that some states have that capacity. States like Taiwan or New Zealand are doing this well, and some community groups have that capacity. But in general, and especially in the United States, we do not have a political system that is capable of experimenting well. And this is the challenge, I believe, as we begin to rethink our role on the planet and our attachments to each other. So In conclusion, experiments can be used as a dangerous tool for extending existing power, whether it's economic inequalities, or data capture, or surveillance. But we've seen that experiments can be a valuable method for building new kinds of societal infrastructure. State that experiments, state that collective learning different scales, hyper-local and hyper-global, one that is perpetually adaptive. So I want to thank Stefano and the organizers of the Milan Triennale for cultivating this discussion. I believe it's of crucial importance. All of us are here because we believe we must create a new and common future. But first, we have to explore and define how we create common futures. We must always actively rediscover how we live together well. Thank you.